Okay. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Southern Maryland Audubon October 2021 Fall Program. My name's Tom Seaton, and I am on the Southern Maryland Audubon Board of Directors, and I help out from time to time with our monthly programs. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Kevin Omland as our program speaker tonight. Dr. Omland is currently a professor of biological sciences at the University of Maryland, UMBC to be precise, and previously obtained degrees in biology from Dartmouth College and the University of Albany, SUNY. Dr. Omland has over 25 years of experience in avian research and advanced education, and has authored and co-authored a multitude of scholarly works on a wide variety of avian subjects, including ecology, evolution, conservation, and the one subject at hand tonight, the role of gender in the study of birds, and in particular, in appreciating the importance of female birdsong. And for those interested in birdsong, this sounds like a fascinating subject. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Omland.
Great, I will unmute. Thanks for that nice introduction, Tom. And one more thing, can you see my cursor just fine at this point around the Baltimore Oriole?
Yes.
Great. Well, I will dive right in. And again, nice to be invited. And I can't wait to give talks like this in person, perhaps to your group again in a few years in the future. And so this picture reminds us of a happy day in Maryland 8 months from now when our state bird shows back up. But not only do we have that bird here in Maryland, but we have this bird in Vermont, where I grew up. And the fact that I grew up in Vermont with this Baltimore Oriole, and that I now work here in Maryland, where I get to work on the Baltimore Oriole still, that's one of the things that influences how I think about what's a typical bird. And so that these Bahama Orioles that I now study in the Bahamas, that those are quite different from the birds I grew up with. And so that really influences where I'm from, who I am, what experiences I've had really influences me as a scientist. And so that's the point of our talk, why diversity matters. And we think that gender biases and geographic biases have played a large role in how female birdsong has been thought about, or more to the point, not thought about for the last 150 plus years. So here's our marvelous Baltimore Oriole. Are you able to hear that? So hopefully you can hear that a little bit. You know, females do sing some, much less we think, and I don't think anyone studied that in detail. That's still an interesting opportunity. But when we go to the tropics, we have many species where both sexes sing. And even in some species we've studied, in the streak-backed oriole in Mexico, in the non-breeding season, the females sing more than the males. And so here's the song of a Bahama oriole. Can you give me a thumbs up if you're hearing that, Tom? No? Okay. And I don't know what sex that is. We do not have a single recording of a Bahama oriole where we know the sex, because we've banded a fair number of birds and we've recorded a fair number of birds, but we haven't focused on that. And so we know both sexes sing, but we don't have any recordings yet and so that's a major next goal of our work. So I'll tell you about our work on female song and gender biases, and then I'll leave the last 15 minutes or so to tell you about our conservation work on the Bahama Oriole. So here's an illustration of the American Ornithological Society, or formerly known as the AOU, meeting back in the late 1800s. And clearly it's an organization dominated by older European American men. There are 1, 2, 3 or so women in that picture. There's some prominent women that really did play really key roles in early ornithology. But for a long time, it clearly was a discipline dominated by men. Even by the late 1900s, this is a picture of a meeting I was at, I think in Arizona, still a predominance of men and clearly dominated by European Americans. And so this whole background really influences how the field of ornithology has developed and how lots of parts of organismal biology research has developed. So I'll give you some background of our work on tropical orioles, talk about elaborate coloration a little bit, then talk about elaborate vocalizations, female song in orioles, blackbirds, and all songbirds, and then talk about our work on gender biases and authorship. As we put it in an article we wrote about it, that women disrupt research on bird song. And then, like I mentioned, I'll talk about our work in the Bahamas, and a lot of that field experience is focused on bringing a more diverse student research team to the Bahamas. So here are these 3 widespread species down in Southern Maryland. I know we have tons and tons of orchard orioles. I'm pretty sure I've seen them down at Kings Landing. Up and down the Patuxent must be a great place for them. So here in the east, we have Baltimore oriole, orchard oriole, Bullock's oriole out west. One thing I like about the orchard oriole, it's the only species, if you pull a feather off an adult of any individual, I can tell you which sex it's from. So that they're completely sexually dichromatic, that the males have this black or this chestnut, where the females is much more this olive gray, and that's no matter how old the female is. In contrast, older female Baltimores, older female Bullocks, we think, can get darker. So anyway, these are typical dichromatic species. But the majority of species in this genus are tropical species. So in Mexico, there's about 15 species. That's probably where the genus first arose, something in the order of 5 or 8 million years ago in Mexico. And it's spread out to the Caribbean, South America, and North America. But the majority of species in the genus are tropical. And in these tropical species, pretty much all the species, with one prominent exception, you can ask me about at the end if we have time, in all these tropical species, the females have elaborate color and pattern. And in all these species that we know of, we've yet to find a tropical species in which the females don't sing. And in most cases, we think the females sing similar or identical songs to the males, though we need to do a lot more work along that. So this is a yellow-backed oriole. I've happened to seen it in Belize. It's a Central American species. This is a species we studied in Eastern Mexico. This is the Altamira oriole on the coast of Veracruz. And I'm holding the female. I've cleverly labeled this with a female symbol. And this is one of my undergraduate students with a male symbol on her hand. And these sexes it's impossible to tell them apart in the field with binoculars. So ultimately, we'll catch them and ban them, and eventually we'll genetically sex birds to determine sex for sure. So this is a PhD student who led our work on coloration back then, named Chris Hoffman. His mom's an artist, so painted this cover for the OC that we published in 2008, showing the elaborate male and female Altamira oriole and the more cryptic female Baltimore oriole. So this is the females changing in coloration is pretty common. So for example, in the Puranga tanagers, the tropical species, both sexes are elaborate, but the females have lost it, we think. Orioles, other types of blackbirds, same thing. So in the North American species, we have sexually dichromatic species. We're used to seeing the elaborate coloration of the males, and we're used to the more muted, dull females. Well, we think that this evolved from elaborate monochromatism, where both the males are elaborate and the females are elaborate. And there's some similar things going on with bird song. And we think the very definition of bird song has really been influenced by the geographic location of the birds being studied, the geographic location of the researchers doing the work, and we believe the gender of the researchers. So in a really important book entitled Bird Song by Clive Catchpole and Peter Slater, they write, songs are complex vocalizations produced by males in the breeding season. So I don't know if you guys can type into the chat. Did anyone hear a Carolina wren singing today? You did. By this definition, though, you didn't, because it's not the breeding season, right? So that thing you know, when we hear, I love hearing Carolina wren singing in October and November. You know, it can't be about the same sort of thing that American redstart is singing about in May. You know, that they're not attracting mates. They're you know, they're not first establishing a territory. So many species in the tropics, when you hear them singing, when you hear a Bahama oriole singing in October or November and it's the female, but it sounds just like the sounds that the males produce in the heart of the breeding season, you know that this simplistic definition is problematic. And this whole definition really assumes that most birdsong evolution happens in males. By the way, I don't think there's a solid, simple definition of birdsong. One of my former students, who I'll talk about, basically says, you know, it's a longer, complex vocalization frequently used in the context of mating, but definitely does not attribute, it doesn't have to be males, of course. And I had the pleasure of doing a sabbatical in Australia a little over 10 years ago. And right down the hall from me was Dr. Naomi Langmore. And lots and lots of Australian birds have female song, and much of Australia is in the tropics or subtropics. And so she and other Australian researchers, several other prominent women, she writes, a historic bias toward behavioral studies in the temperate northern hemisphere has led to the perception that female song is rare and anomalous behavior, that it's something weird. When we hear a female sing, it's a strange thing. But if you live in Northern Australia, you don't think that female song is rare or strange. And so this whole viewpoint sort of says maybe song evolution involves females as well. And so the research done in my lab on this topic was led by a former PhD student, Dr. Karen Odom. So she got her PhD from UMBC. She graduated from University of Maryland, Baltimore County in 2016. And while she was at UMBC, she got a fellowship from the National Science Foundation, the East Asia Pacific Summer Institute Fellowship, to go work with Dr. Langmore. And so there was a team of 5 of us. I played a minor supporting role, but two researchers from Australia, as well as a researcher from the Netherlands. And so Karen led this effort and compiled this huge data set on whether or not females sing, and as many birds, songbirds, as they could get their hands on, basically. And so based on published information, Karen and team found that song was present in 71% of the species surveyed. So we undertook this survey because we thought we might get something along these lines. Maybe we'd find that 40, 50, 60% of females, of species would have female song. So even in the course of doing this research, we were surprised at the high levels recorded. Furthermore, we used a detailed evolutionary tree of all the songbirds and reconstructed that female song was likely present in the common ancestor of all songbirds, which evolved in Australia about 50 million years ago. So the fact that many Australian lineages and nearly every family of birds has female song present in it, all of that enables us statistically say that female song was likely present in that common ancestor. So we used to ask the question, why did bird song evolve in males? And the new question is, why did bird song evolve in both sexes? So it's really a completely new paradigm for thinking about the evolution of bird song. And so now we can also ask, why is female song lost or diminished in temperate species? So it takes that initial paradigm and really flips it on its head. And how that came about, we think, is a really crucial part of the story. So as we were doing this research, we'd often sit back and talk about this. Gosh, there was that paper by Faribaugh in 1982, paper by Naomi Langmore I mentioned. I already mentioned Karen Odom. Gosh, a lot of the people leading this research are women. And there are some key men as well. And one of the most important is right across the river from and down a little bit at St. Mary's College of Maryland, Dr. Jordan Price. Jordan gives an amazing talk. So if you want to hear more about this, he's has a slightly different way of framing it. We've collaborated on a lot of this. He's studied both coloration and song. So he was clearly an important person, but for the most part, there have been lots and lots of women who've led this work. And so our question was, are women more likely to study female song? So this is work led by a former undergraduate of mine, Casey Haynes, when she worked closely with my PhD student, Evangeline Rose. And Casey found all female song articles published from 1997 through 2016. So she found 59 papers that had female song in the abstract or in the title of the article. And so if there was a paper published in the Journal of Avian Biology in 2015 on birdsong, on female song, she found another article in that same journal from the same year, a control data set about birdsong articles. So these are studies that the birdsong that did not talk about female song. And we compared the authors of these two groups of studies. So the female song articles, 68% of the first authors of these songs were women. But of the birdsong articles, only 44% of the first authors were women. So women were 24% more likely to study female song in this study. So that's statistically significant. Again, we suspected we'd find a pattern like this, but the strength of the pattern we found was even stronger than we expected. And so Casey, as an undergraduate, was able to be a first author on a paper that came out in Animal Behavior in 2020. We also wrote an article for The Conversation about this. That article has now been read about 200,000 times. So this work we've done, and that, an excellent undergraduate at UMBC, just a Maryland kid from a small town, sharp as a tack and worked very hard and was able to get this paper published in Animal Behavior. That's really had impact far beyond the world of birdsong. So I hope some of you dig into that and find that article in The Conversation if you have time later. Casey also asked who is leading the research group. So usually have the students be the first author, but the last one is frequently the guy who's running the project. Again, that's something that's changing and that needs to change more. But even in the birdsong literature, although there's still a lot of women conducting this research, the majority of the last authors, even in female song papers, are still men. So, it's common to have women be a smaller percentage of the full professorship, even in more equal fields. I was thinking about when I first entered the department I entered in graduate school in 1990 at SUNY Albany. There were like 4 or 5 women in the department and 20 or 30 men. So that's been changing, but still a lot of even in our department, we have a pretty gender equal department at UMBC, but I think it's still a situation where 7 of the 10 full professors are men. So we feel that in order to get the full benefits of gender diversity, there need to be more women at higher ranks. And ornithology and animal behavior are certainly not the worst offenders in this regard. Certainly fields of engineering, computer science. I was just looking into research in astrobiology, all fields that are still really dominated by men, and we think missing out because of that. So the first 100 plus years of birdsong research have been dominated by European researchers and European American researchers, especially men. And then a new generation of researchers in the last 20 years, especially women, have led to increasing recognition of the importance of female song. So it's really resulted in overturning the paradigm for thinking about the original evolution of birdsong. And so we think women were absolutely key for this. So if fewer women had been brought into the field, fewer women had been recruited to do research on this, that it would have taken us longer, or perhaps not even gotten to some of the new questions that we've come up with. So for years, people were asking, why did males originally involve song? Was it to attract mates? Was it to fight with each other for access to mates? Those are clearly important. But the original evolution of birdsong probably involved both sexes. And we think, for example, both sexes defending territories year-round in the tropics is really crucial. So who we are, where we are from, the experience we have had really influences the science that we do. So I try incredibly hard to enable my students to understand how crucial it is for this to do the science they do in as unbiased a way as possible. So for example, sometimes we're able to do blind experiments. We're able to play songs and not know what sex is being played, for example, when we're doing the observations, because we really need to work hard to get around the biases we have. And some of the biases come from these kind of sources. So we think more diverse groups of researchers can tackle a greater diversity of questions, can utilize more diverse methods and conceptual approaches. And so we think the research we've done on female birdsong provides a dramatic example of the importance of diversity for progress in all scientific fields. So here's the article I mentioned that we published in The Conversation, just a couple pages, but it's sort of, we try to make it clear that this is has a lot of broad applicability. And just to emphasize the acknowledgements that Karen Odom, Evangeline Rose, the former PhD student, and Casey were absolutely key in this research. So I can take 2 or 3 minutes and answer questions people have about that part of the talk, or I can take a quick drink and launch right into our work on conservation in the Bahama oil. Hearing nothing, I'll forge ahead, but there's plenty of time, should be plenty of time when I wrap up the other part as well. So hold on to questions that you have. So I did want to share with you about the work we're doing in the Bahamas on a species that's considered critically endangered, the Bahama oriole. And we've been doing lots of student research projects, especially focused on population ecology. And this has been funded by the US National Science Foundation by an International Research Experience for Students grant. And a major goal of this grant is to help diversify the students that are able to go to the tropics and do research on animal behavior and ecology and conservation. And because I'm at UMBC, because we have such a diverse student population, because our state is such a diverse state, we're really in a position to move the needle on this issue and really make progress. Again, I said I grew up in Vermont. If I was a faculty member at the University of Vermont, I think it'd be harder for me to play a meaningful role in helping to diversify ornithology and birding. So the Caribbean is a global biodiversity hotspot. The number of different bird species and lizard species and plant species that have evolved as they've been separated on these islands is incredible. So it's really amazing flora and fauna, including 22 threatened songbird species. So they're facing introduced predators such as cats, cowbirds that have spread throughout the Caribbean, increasing hurricane strength, sea level rise. So there are 8 endemic orioles. There are species that are considered least concern, LC. There's a Cuban oriole, a Jamaican oriole, one on Hispaniola, and the Puerto Rican oriole. All of those are considered least concern. There's 3 species over here in the Lesser Antilles that are all considered either vulnerable or endangered. And then here in the Bahamas is the critically endangered Bahama oriole. So the Bahama Oriole is now restricted to the Andros Island complex. So it's about 250 miles southeast of Miami. Andros is the largest island in the Bahamas. It's about over something in the order of 5,000 to 6,000 square kilometers. It's about the size of the state of Delaware. So it's really a huge area of land. And one of the key things is they used to be found on the island of Abaco as well, but they were extirpated. They went locally extinct. They disappeared from Abaco in the 1990s. And the fact that we don't know why, what factors led to their disappearance there, that's a problem. So if you know, I always say, if you know you're looking for an older white man and driving a Honda blue CRV, then you know what you're looking for. You're looking for me, and you know I'm the culprit. But if you don't know what you're looking for, it's a lot more problematic. So we don't know whether it was cats, or we don't think it was hurricanes. There was no series of hurricanes that hit hard in the years leading up to that. There had been some logging. There's certainly other invasive predators. So we're really not sure, and that's one of the reasons that this was listed as critically endangered, because suddenly something major happened in their distribution and no one really understood why it was. I do want to quickly mention that there's a lot of other marvelous species of birds that you can see on Andros, many others endemic to the Bahamas or endemic to the Caribbean. So I'm always a bit on a mission to encourage people to go birding in the Bahamas, and perhaps even on Andros in particular. Now, there had been previous research done on the Oriole. It had been part of a PhD project, so it's an individual PhD project just with like one helper for a few short field seasons. And they were able to make some important discoveries, but they really focused on settlements along the East Coast. So all of these red dots are places where they found breeding Orioles, but almost all of them were either along the coast on settlements or in this small part of internal highway. So they really focused on the settlements, and they called the Orioles synanthropic, that they really, as if they were really relying on human developed areas. Now, other Orioles do benefit from disturbance, so this didn't seem completely unreasonable. It was a little surprising that they seemed to be so dependent on coconut palms. So it really seemed like 90% of the nests were in coconut palms in developed areas. And coconut palms are an introduced species, so they were brought there by the Spaniards or other European travelers, something in the order of 200, 300, 500 years ago. So it didn't quite make sense to us that they had to be so reliant on this introduced species. And because they were really just focused on the settlements and were not able to do much research in these vast pine forests that just extend throughout these huge islands, they really thought that they were only something in the order of 140 to 250 total. But they really didn't do anything to specifically quantify how well they'd surveyed the island. And they really didn't have sufficient resources to spend time in the pine forest. So the main thing we've done is really compared what happens in these disturbed areas, especially developed habitats, to the native pine forest. So that's what I'll talk about next. So here are the Bahama Orioles. The adults have this marvelous jet black plumage, yellow plumage on the belly and on the rump area, for example. So it doesn't look 100, it looks a little like a Baltimore Oriole with yellow instead of orange. Of course, it doesn't have as prominent a wing bar, etc. But the yearlings, and this might be a yearling male or a yearling female. Again, we don't know the sexes of hardly any of these birds in the photos because when we took the photos, they hadn't been banded yet. So adults of either sex look like this, and yearling birds or juveniles of either sex look like this. And the juveniles do breed, and we've found them nesting both sexes quite frequently. So our first question was, are these Orioles out nesting in these pine forests far from settlements? And the answer is yes. So here was a Bahamas National Trust intern. He was the first one to find them nesting in the pine forest in a pine tree. And then here's the UMBC undergraduate a photo just after he's found the first nest in one of these understory short thatch palm trees that are in the understory of the pine forest. So we now know that many birds are out in the pine forest nesting there, and that was a huge initial discovery. So the undergraduate team published that in the Journal of Caribbean Ornithology in 2018. So once we knew they were in the pine forest, we said, does pine forest equal pine forest equals pine forest, or are there certain parts of the pine forest that are especially important? And the good news is we have found orioles nesting in many different parts of the pine forest, and more open forest and very, very sparse forests and very dense forests. But we do frequently find them in the tallest tree. So at the scale of what we call the micro scale, the nest tree, they're frequently nesting in the tallest tree. So here's the average of the palms in the area versus in every case, they're nesting in the tallest tree that's in the area. And then we also know that when you look at how at the sort of the scale of the territory, if there are more of these tall thatch palms in the area, then they're more likely to be nesting there. So having more tall thatch palms in the pine forest is likely a key thing. So UMBC alum Brianna Yancey was able to publish that in 2020. Next question, the huge one. Were there really only a few hundred individuals left? A couple of earlier studies had suggested there really might be as few as, a few hundred, certainly less than 300. But we've been able to do studies. This was led by a UMBC student, just finished up a master's at Villanova, actually Michael Rowley and Rick Stanley, who was a master's student at the Imperial College of London. So they were a great team, and they conducted these 400 plus point counts. And here, every dot is where they did a count, and the black dots are where they did not detect an oriole. And the white dots are places where they did detect the oriole. So they detected 75 orioles during the month and a half, 2 months they were doing these counts. And a lot of, they did detect orioles in these settlements along roadsides, but many, many orioles were detected out in these green western areas, out in pine forest far from the settlements. And so this was all very good news, that it really seems like the majority of the population nests out in these pine forests. And we've estimate, just in our study site, which is this northern part of North Andros, something in the order of 1,200 to 2,800 individuals remaining. And then we've said, okay, this is about on 1/2 to 1/3 of all of the possible habitat. Thus, really roughly, we think there's probably at least 2,000 individuals and maybe something as many as 8,000 individuals, but a lot more work needs to be done to hone that number in. But it's a lot higher, at least something like 10, 20, 30 times more than initially feared. I mentioned early on that a lot of these species are threatened by cowbirds. So the cowbirds come in and lay their eggs and either end up pushing out the young orioles, or the cowbirds destroy the oriole nest. Here's a case where this is a fledgling cowbird, and we have at least 3 or 4 nests where we know one cowbird got out of the nest, but no orioles fledged. So the orioles had no reproductive success in those cases. And so in developed areas, 82%, 9 of the 11 nests we found were parasitized. Whereas in undeveloped areas, in these pine forests, 0% were parasitized. So that's a huge difference. And again, more good news for the species, because the majority are out in the pine forest. And when they're nesting out there, they're really not being hit hard by these cowbirds. What about the territories? I kind of assumed they were like orchard orioles and Baltimore orioles, and they move around, 2 or 3, 500 or 400 meters. But most of these territories seem like they're more like up to a half a square kilometer. They're flying 2 or 3 or 5 times as far as we typically see Baltimore orioles and orchard orioles flying around here. So this work was led by an undergraduate named Sheridan Donquois. Sheridan is now a second-year dental school student at a place called Harvard. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of Harvard Dental School. I actually don't know too much about the dental school, but we're very proud that Sheridan's moved on to Harvard. We lost him to ornithology, but he'll be a great dentist. So he really led this work. He figured out how to use the equipment that we'd had in the lab for a number of years, but that I wasn't very familiar with. And it was just amazing to track these birds with him and show how much larger area they were using than we had thought. We also have some sense of what's going on with invasive predators. We thought the cats might be sort of restricted to settlements. We thought they might not get enough water out in the pine forest. But we had this intensive study plot. We put out 23 cameras, and we were able to get repeated pictures of quite a few of these cats. So here's what Brianna decided was cat 3, that had several black stripes on its right rear leg. And you can see that on that front angle, and you can see it on the side angle. So just in our 7 square kilometer study site, her best estimate is there were approximately 8 cats using that, 2 of which had kittens. So here's 2 little cute invasive predator kittens. So these are 3 or 4 kilometers from the nearest settlement, and we've seen cats 10, 20 kilometers from the nearest settlement. So these aren't cats that are being fed in someone's backyard or that got away last year. These have probably been established there for many years, and I don't know if that's 5, 10 years or 20, 30, 50 years or 100 years. But the cat population seems very well established. So it's undoubtedly killing some orioles, killing some other migrant songbirds that are down there. Here it's killing a frog. We don't have any birds in the mouth, but that we have photos of. But there, Brianna caught it with a frog in its mouth. So clearly that's a big issue. And since it's such a remote island, it's really different than many cat problem situations. Just had a PhD student. She's resubmitting this paper today. It should be published very soon. Classifying using remote sensing. We literally can't get out to these places. You have to fly to them. It's just some of the most remote, difficult to access habitats in anywhere in the Caribbean. So using remote sensing, Janine's been able to map where the pine forests are and show that there are big chunks of pine forest out in these western parts of some of these islands. And hopefully these are good habitats for the orioles as well. So I have a new PhD student. She's going to be studying female song and studying their territory usage throughout the year. So we've done lots of work in May and June, but we have very little idea what's happening in the dry season, what's happening in December, January, February. And so we want to know if the orioles stick in that pine forest year round, or if there's some other key habitats that they move out to. So again, to thank all the students who've helped over the years, especially those funded by this National Science Foundation grant. So here was the 2017 crew. I think this is 2018, and this was the 2019 crew. And not surprisingly, we weren't able to do one in 2020 and 2022, but we're putting together the 2021. So the last 2 years we haven't done it, but we're putting together the crew for 2022, and we hope to be back next May. So just to emphasize that we really think our study gives a really strong demonstration of the importance of gender diversity for good science and diversity in many types, that diverse researchers can produce more diverse approaches, can really lead to novel insights. And again, being at UMBC, I've had the opportunity to be a STRIDE faculty diversity fellow. UMBC is known for the diversity of our student body, and we've been increasing the diversity of our faculty. And we think that's really important for our students and our state and for science more broadly. And this was an interesting thing. It was a tough year for birding. This was something that sort of came out after the difficult incidents in a number of realms, but including the birding incident in Central Park. And the Cornell Lab of Ornithology stated, "Those of us who treasure the joys of bird watching, taking part in conservation, and feeling free in the outdoors must constantly strive to make these pursuits equitable, broadly accessible, and universally welcoming. So, I think that's a real opportunity for those of us who love birding, who love birds, who love the parks of Southern Maryland, that we have an opportunity to really increase the constituency of birds and of environmental issues, conservation more broadly. And last little pitch to go birding in the Bahamas if you have a chance. Andros is a spectacular, adventurous place to bird. Let me know if you're interested in more info. Thank you very much for your interest.
Thank you. This was just a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. Your work is really extraordinary, and that of your students. I have one question. And, any of us who bird in the tropics realize that the tropical species are more vocal than those in our environment. Why is that? Do we know?
I don't know. And yeah, too much of my birding recently hasn't, I haven't had a chance to go to a tropical rainforest for at least 10 years. So but one thing that does occur to me is that the species we've studied, they are
Kevin, I think you're muted.
great. Did you hear me a little bit, Molly?
No, you cut off right when you were starting
Okay.
to give your reasons of what it might be.
So the fact that the orioles we study, we know that they're defending territories year round. So female streak-backed orioles are singing a lot in November, December, and January. And so possibly if song is being used by both sexes year round, that could be part of that story. But I like the idea of trying to think about that more broadly.
Kevin, this is Tom. Can you hear me?
Yes, Tom, thanks.
Good. So one thing that I think, at least in my experience, causes at least me to think about males being the predominant vocalizer in the bird world is they're the ones you see singing. That's just maybe that's just my male bias. I don't know. But, for indigo buntings, for example, I don't see, or I haven't really noticed female indigo buntings singing, but males sing like crazy. So am I just, is that my bias coming through? Are the females actually singing as much? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I don't know if female indigo buntings sing. I suspect they don't. On the other hand, we've just wrapped up a study of orchard orioles. And I studied orchard orioles in Upper Marlboro for 5 years before it occurred to me to look and see whether or not the females were singing. And so the first day I said, gosh, I wonder if the females sing at all. And the first day I asked myself the question, I saw it. So I'm not the most observant scientist, but there's been quite a few cases in our lab when we're looking for one thing, that's what you find. So I think there are many other species in the temperate zone. We think that females sing much less than males, and it's in the tropics where there's much more similarity between the male and female song, and much more similarity in how much they sing. Another example that we've studied are eastern bluebirds. So it turns out female eastern bluebirds sing, and for the most part, you can't tell the song apart but they sing much less and they sing much less loudly. So, so I think there are a bunch, there are good reasons for the biases we had. And if you bird in Maryland, especially in May and June, most of the singing will be from males. But don't expect that to be true in the tropics. And if you're going out and when people do breeding bird surveys, and they assume that all the birds singing are males. So if you estimate there are 100 birds, you heard 100 birds on your route, therefore there must be 200 birds, right? Because you only heard the males. But if not knowing how much, which sex is singing in these tropical species that aren't well studied, that could really lead us astray.
Yeah, I totally get that. In my experience, I hate to, I'm only going to focus on indigo buntings because that's what's come to mind, and that's what we have down here in abundance. You hear them singing and you immediately register it as a male singing bird, because that's what we're only supposed to count males that are singing. in this particular study I'm a part of, it's the BBA3. I don't know if you're familiar with it. The Maryland Bird Breeding Atlas 3 project, and the focus is on male singing. So I go out in the field and I'll hear an indigo bunting singing. I won't see it. I'll register it as a possible breeder. But it could very well be a female for all I know, because I'm not actually seeing it. It's hidden away somewhere. But the males typically are at a high point of a tree or whatever, and you can easily see them singing. So,
Right. Does anyone in the audience have a favorite Maryland bird where they've seen the females singing loudly?
Well, I've had the experience of a mallard pair in the tidal pond near my house, and it's almost exclusively the female that you hear. She's
Indeed.
standing guard and watching, and you hear her loud call,
Yeah.
her warning calls and her communication calls to the other. In fact, it seems to be, from just my observation of this pair, that the males' quacks are much quieter and much less frequent.
Yeah, they just do this little rape, 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 rape. So if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, what is it? It's a female duck. So that's an interesting example. And that's sort of not a learned song. It's not a complex vocalization, but I've never heard anyone focus on that. I think it's fascinating that the female ducks are the one that when you hear quack, 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 that's a female. And that's true in mallards. I assume it's true in black ducks. I'd love to know what it's like across other ducks as well. There's a great songbird that sings a lot. The female cardinal also sings quite a bit. So there have definitely been times when I'm like, oh, listen to that male cardinal singing. And you look up, maybe 2, 3, 5% of the time, but female cardinals do sing a beautiful, loud song.
Female cardinals sing in the same melody that the males do?
I don't think it's possible to tell them apart by sound.
Wow. See, that's news to me. I guess this is just my male bias coming through, because I just assumed every time I hear one of those typical cardinal calls, it's the male. But you're saying it's possibly the female.
Indeed. And to me, it's a whole new dimension, right? When I get to look up and see, and there's a cardinal singing, and it's even to me, who's been sort of studying this intentionally for the last 10 years, I still get surprised by and get a kick out of seeing a female cardinal singing and belting it out.
Wow.
But where do you draw the line between singing and calling? Because both the male and female owls call to each other and duet, and Carolina wrens sing together in duet, and Carolina wrens will duet with their little nestlings as well, as when the fledglings are going around the neighborhood. they'll be sitting there smuttering and making all their little noises to the little ones as well.
So I think one of the things I like to emphasize is that, you know, we as humans like to put things in boxes and like to categorize things, but that nature frequently is difficult to categorize. So, you know, that the owl vocalizations and the duck vocalizations, or even a rooster, cock-a-doodle-doo, you know, those are all not considered songs, but they're all sort of elaborate vocalizations used in the context of mate attraction, territory defense. And so I think it's worth us thinking broadly about them. Do read the article published in Birding on female bird song by my student Karen Odom and our colleague Lauren Benedict at the University of Northern Colorado. And they propose a pretty solid new way of thinking about how to define song. But certainly part of the point is don't be too rigid, that, you know, appreciate and study and take account of the wide range of vocalizations produced by both sexes. But, you know, just if you can tell the difference, you know, it's the vocalizations that the female cardinal produces are, you know, the same. Statistically, when we study the bluebirds, there's no statistical way to distinguish the vocalizations produced by the females from the complex vocalizations produced by the males. So on the other end of the continuum, you know, if you have a robin going chip, 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 and they're, you know, mobbing a snake or something like that, then that's fairly easy to say that's its call. And so, but there are going to be some places in the middle where you're like, I'm not, should we call that a song or a call? There will be interesting middle cases.
Also, has there any research been done on the possibility of vocalizations that can be recognized by different species? Because I've noticed that when a snake appears in my backyard, there seems to be a distinctive call that many different birds make and the other birds recognize.
Nice. I do not know that kind of research, but I know people have done that for sure. And I don't know if there's anything known about Maryland species. I wish I knew the answer. I think our friend Google would help you find some more on that as well, even Google Scholar. That's definitely interesting. And colleagues in Australia, I think, have studied this a little bit as well. Some of the most famous research has to do with monkeys making different vocalizations for different predators. And, you know, and even, you know, the mammals can listen in on bird alarms and vice versa. So neat question.
Well, it seems to me one of the takeaways from this, at least for me, is that when we hear a bird singing in the spring, it might be worth spending some time just to try to actually see it singing, you know, so we can, you know, get a handle on this issue a little bit more and more fully appreciate what we're actually hearing and what we're dealing with out in the field. You know, again, going back to the cardinal, you know, the male in February and March, they sit at the top of the highest tree in the neighborhood and sing. And you don't see the female doing that, but she might very well be at a lower story somewhere else.
But again, the prepared mind, Tom, I can't wait for you to see your first female cardinal singing in February or March next year. And send me an email, and I hope you enjoy it. It's a fun sight. It's right at the top. It's, you know, they're behaviorally, they do the same thing. And it, you know, again, maybe it's only 2, 3, 5, 10% of the time, but I love it when I see a female cardinal singing like that, and I'm just like, wow, that's a female. She is belting it out. So,
you know, another bird that we hear a lot around here are prairie warblers, and they're a little bit harder to see. even the males. But boy, if the females are doing the same ZZZ up, that would be really interesting to know.
Yeah, the most famous female singing warblers are female chestnut-sided warblers. So I'm not even sure I've heard them, but female chestnut-sided warblers are well known for singing. You know, there probably are other species in Maryland where females sing occasionally and no one has documented it. So
Yeah.
So keep your ears out. That's one of the things. So I would love to keep chatting, but my 16-year-old needs a little bit of encouragement to get back to homework, etc. And my wife's out of town.
Okay.
So I should go back to being a dad. And anyone, unless someone has one final question, they're just burning to know with regard to female song and work on orioles. Well, thanks for the invitation.
Well,
Tom, I think you saw an email that
yes.
you and I can stay in touch about any of these other wrap-up things. But thanks for everyone's interest and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Kevin. This has been fascinating, and I'm sure everyone enjoyed it. So thank you so much.
Have a great night.
Thanks.